January 25th, 1995. Began like any other winter morning along the frigid Norwegian coast, a landscape swallowed by darkness where the sun barely rose above the horizon, and where the North Sea winds screamed across fishing towns, still half frozen from the night before. But inside a small scientific outpost near Andøya, a team of Norwegian and American researchers prepared to launch a WWIII sounding rocket to study the aurora borealis, an ordinary atmospheric experiment that had been planned for months, publicly announced, and cleared with international airspace authorities. But what none of them knew was that thousands of kilometers away, deep in the heart of the Kremlin, the Russian Federation's early warning system was degrading, malfunctioning, and dangerously paranoid, the leftover skeleton of a collapsed superpower clinging to nuclear-age reflexes it could barely maintain. The Soviet Union had died 4 years earlier, but its nuclear command infrastructure, the satellites, radar stations, launch protocols, and doomsday logic built over decades, still haunted the newly formed Russian state like a ghost that refused to leave. In the wake of the USSR's collapse, Russia found itself in a catastrophic economic freefall, its military budget slashed by 80%, its radar stations unstaffed, its early warning satellites drifting blind in decaying orbits, and its nuclear command officers, once the elite guardians of a global empire, now working inside freezing bunkers without pay, fighting to hold together a nuclear arsenal of over 20,000 warheads with fewer resources than a small NATO base. Missed paychecks, broken equipment, leaking roofs, and failing radar arrays were the new reality. Yet the nuclear protocols, fast launch procedures designed for a Cold War confrontation with the United States, remained active, unchanged, and terrifyingly brittle. In this unstable environment, the Russian military grew hypersensitive to anything that might resemble a surprise attack, especially a submarine-launched Trident missile, which could hit Moscow in less than 10 minutes. And so, when the Black Brant rocket rose into the Arctic sky at 7:24 a.m., glowing like a spear of fire as it broke through the cloud cover, Russian radar stations in the Kola Peninsula immediately detected it, not as a harmless scientific probe, but as the unmistakable signature of a nuclear first strike. The rocket's flight path was near identical to that of a U.S. Trident D5, launched from a submarine in the Norwegian Sea. The exact trajectory of an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, burst designed to blind Russian radar before a full-scale nuclear barrage. For the first time in history, the highest level of nuclear alert, the Cheget protocol, known in the West as the Russian nuclear briefcase, was activated. President Boris Yeltsin, still half asleep in his Kremlin residence, was abruptly awakened by military aides rushing into his bedroom, carrying a black leather suitcase connected directly to the Russian nuclear command network. No Russian leader, not even during the most dangerous days of the Cold War, had ever opened this briefcase in a real-world alert. The generals around Yeltsin were pale, tense, their voices clipped with panic. Satellite detection windows were blind due to technical failures. The early warning network was half dead, and Russia had only radar readings to rely on, readings showing a fast-moving projectile heading toward Russian airspace. In the bunker below the Kremlin, the general staff began calculating launch times. If the Americans had launched a Trident missile armed with a nuclear warhead designed to detonate in the upper atmosphere and cripple Russia's command and control systems, Moscow would have only a few minutes to decide whether to retaliate. Inside the crisis room, officers debated whether the rocket was a precursor to a decapitation strike, part of NATO's long-feared first strike window, taking advantage of Russia's weakened state. Yeltsin, bleary-eyed but now fully awake, found himself thrust into the most terrifying scenario imaginable for a leader, deciding whether to order a nuclear response based on incomplete data, failing sensors, and a world where Russia felt cornered, humiliated, and collapsing. And while the scientific team in Norway celebrated their successful atmospheric launch with coffee and notebooks full of aurora readings, they had no idea that their experiment was triggering the most serious nuclear crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russian radar operators watched the Black Brant climb higher, separating into stages, accelerating along a steep arc, a profile matching U.S. missile protocols. Officers began preparing the nuclear command chain, and for the first time since the dissolution of the USSR, the strategic rocket forces were ordered to open authorization safes, ready their keys, and await the command to bring missile silos to full readiness. The air in the Kremlin war room was electric with dread. Every face reflected the same unspoken horror. The United States might be striking now, while Russia was weak, blind, and unstable. Yeltsin opened the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, activating a direct line between himself, Defense Minister Pavel Grachev, and the Chief of the General Staff, Mikhail Kolesnikov. His hands shook slightly as he entered his personal nuclear authorization codes, something no Soviet or Russian leader had ever done outside practice drills. This wasn't an exercise. This wasn't a theory. This was the real thing. And if Russia miscalculated, even by a few minutes, the result would be global annihilation. The General Staff tracked the rocket's trajectory second by second. They had only a sliver of time to determine whether it was an attack. If it was an EMP burst, Russia's remaining early warning abilities would be wiped out in seconds, leaving no time to launch missiles. The officers urged caution, but some were ready to retaliate instantly. The Russian doctrine of launch on warning demanded immediate counterstrike in the event of a suspected nuclear attack, even before impact. But Yeltsin, unlike the hardened Soviet leaders before him, hesitated. His instincts told him something was wrong. Why would the Americans launch a single missile? Why now? Why on that trajectory? And why was there no parallel military activity from NATO? As the Black Brant reached its apex, Russia approached the point of no return. The next minutes would determine whether nuclear war began. Yeltsin stared at the trajectory map, jaw tight, knuckles white around the handle of the nuclear briefcase. His generals waited for the order. Across Russia, missile crews stood poised to turn keys that would unleash thousands of megatons of destructive power. And then, at the last possible moment, Russian trackers noticed something unexpected. The rocket began descending, away from Russian airspace. It wasn't turning toward Moscow. It wasn't preparing for an EMP burst. It wasn't a threat. It was leaving Earth's upper atmosphere, heading harmlessly back toward the sea. It was, as Norway had said in its diplomatic notification months earlier, a scientific rocket. The crisis evaporated in seconds. The tension broke like glass. Men who had been seconds from initiating the destruction of civilization exhaled in stunned disbelief. Yeltsin closed the nuclear briefcase. The apocalypse had been avoided by instinct, hesitation, and pure luck. But the world would not learn how close it came that day until years later, when a quiet note buried in a Russian Ministry of Defense report revealed the truth. On January 25, 1995, Russia prepared to launch a full-scale nuclear retaliation against a weather rocket. The panic inside the Kremlin did not simply vanish once the rocket dipped away from Russian airspace. Instead, what followed was a long, suffocating period of aftershock as the Russian military, political leadership, and intelligence services tried to process what had nearly happened, because the terrifying truth was that nothing about the incident looked like an innocent mistake from their perspective. Every detail, every technical signature, every radar return had matched the exact profile of a U.S. Trident D5 nuclear missile fired from a submarine in the Norwegian Sea, and that realization forced Russia's weakened command structure to confront the reality that their early warning system had become so degraded and unreliable that it could no longer distinguish between a scientific rocket and a strategic nuclear strike. As Yeltsin sat with the now closed Chagate briefcase beside him, he listened as the General Staff debriefed what they had seen. The flight path was consistent with a U.S. EMP pre-strike. The first stage burn looked identical to a submarine-launched ballistic missile, and the speed matched the initial boost phase of a nuclear-armed projectile. Even more disturbing was the fact that several of Russia's early warning satellites were offline that morning due to orbit decay and power failures, deficiencies that had been accumulating for years as Russia struggled under economic collapse, which meant that the entire detection burden had fallen on ground-based radar systems that were nearly blind to high-altitude objects rising along steep trajectories. The officers explained in somber tones that if the rocket had climbed only a few degrees closer to Russia's border, just a small shift in its launch angle, the automatic algorithms responsible for tracking it would have flagged it as a confirmed threat, removing human discretion from the decision and triggering a fully automated alert that would have forced Russia into a retaliatory launch sequence within minutes. Yeltsin, already dealing with political turmoil, economic catastrophe, and a country unraveling from within, understood the magnitude of the close call. A single scientific rocket, launched openly and with prior diplomatic notification, had nearly initiated global nuclear war because the Russian early warning system was falling apart faster than anyone had admitted. As the shock rippled through the Kremlin, intelligence officials from the FSB and GRU were called in to assess whether the incident might have been a deliberate test by the United States, a probe to evaluate Russia's radar coverage, response times, and nuclear readiness. Old Soviet instincts kicked in. Was this a feint, the first phase of a larger operation? Was NATO exploiting Russia's weakness? Was the United States analyzing how quickly Russia reached for the nuclear briefcase? These suspicions grew even stronger when it was discovered that the Black Brant WWIII rocket carried multiple booster stages, exactly the kind of multi-pulse signature that a nuclear decapitation strike might use to mask its true payload. And though Norway had indeed notified Russian diplomatic channels in advance, the notification had never reached the military units responsible for monitoring airspace. Buried in a backlog of unprocessed communication, the message had simply disappeared, one more casualty of Russia's bureaucratic collapse. Meanwhile, deep inside the Strategic Rocket Force's command bunkers, officers who had been seconds away from turning missile launch keys stood in stunned silence, some staring at the countdown clocks still frozen on their displays, others replaying in their minds the horrifying possibility that history would have remembered them as the men who vaporized New York, Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris over a scientific experiment. These men had trained for nuclear war their entire lives, but none had expected to face a real-world launch order triggered by a single ambiguous radar blip. Many of them later admitted that the fear of misinterpretation was worse than the fear of death. They were terrified of being tricked by their own failing systems. In the hours after the incident, emergency meetings convened across Russia's sprawling military structure. Defense Minister Pavel Grachev demanded immediate reports from every radar station and early warning base. The General Staff requested diagnostics on every surviving early warning satellite, only to find that out of the dozens Russia had once operated during the Soviet era, only a small handful were still functional, and most were operating on borrowed time. Engineers explained that Russia's launch-on warning doctrine, designed for the Soviet Union at its peak, was now dangerously incompatible with Russia's degraded capabilities. The system no longer had the sensors, satellites, or redundancies required to confidently detect real attacks, meaning false alarms would become more likely as time went on. The Norwegian rocket incident was not an outlier. It was the new normal. And so Russia faced a brutal paradox. The weaker its early warning network became, the more likely it was to misinterpret innocent signals as nuclear threats, and the closer it would drift toward accidental war. Across the world, the United States and NATO remained completely unaware of the crisis unfolding inside Russia. The Black Brant launch had come and gone. The scientists had collected their data, and Western military leaders treated the event as trivial. For nearly 24 hours after the near launch, not a single U.S. intelligence analyst had any idea that Russia had opened its nuclear briefcase, elevated its alert levels, and prepared for retaliatory strike authorization. Only later, after intercepted Russian communications hinted at unusual activity, did NSA and CIA analysts begin to suspect that something extraordinary had occurred. When the truth finally emerged through diplomatic channels, high-ranking American officials were stunned. They had believed the Cold War was over. They had believed that Russia's nuclear threat was diminishing. They had believed that diplomatic notification of scientific launches was enough to avoid confusion. They were wrong, horribly wrong. The revelation that Russia had been minutes away from launching nuclear weapons in response to a weather rocket shocked the U.S. national security community. The CIA produced internal reports warning that Russia's nuclear posture was dangerously unstable, that their early warning network was crumbling, and that further false alarms were not only possible but likely. Some analysts argued that Russia was now more dangerous in peacetime than it had been at the height of the Cold War, because at least during the Cold War, both sides had fully functional detection systems and relatively predictable behavior. Now Russia was blind, anxious, and ruled by a leadership struggling to maintain control over a decaying superpower. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the political consequences of the incident rippled outward. Hardliners within the military used the event to argue that the United States could not be trusted, that NATO was testing Russia's response times, and that Russia must rebuild its nuclear infrastructure before it collapsed entirely. More moderate voices argued that the near launch demonstrated the need for cooperation, communication, and transparency between the nuclear powers. But the Russian economy was in ruins. Oligarchs were looting the state. Organized crime controlled entire regions, and the military was struggling to feed its soldiers. There was no money to rebuild the early warning system. As for Yeltsin, the incident deepened his fear of accidental war. He knew how close he had come to ordering a retaliatory strike, how easily the world could have ended because of a radar signature and a missing diplomatic memo. In private conversations with aides, he later admitted that the moment he held the nuclear briefcase was the most terrifying experience of his life. But ironically, the crisis also gave him something he desperately needed, a rare moment of confidence from the Russian military, who saw that he had remained calm under pressure. In the days after the incident, Russian generals told him that he had made the right call, even if it had been guided more by intuition than by reliable data. But the long-term question remained: What if the next ambiguous radar signal appeared during a leadership crisis, a regional war, or a moment of heightened tension? What if Russia's next president was not as cautious as Yeltsin? What if a future false alarm occurred at night, when radar crews were understaffed, or during a military exercise? The Norwegian rocket incident made one thing chillingly clear. Accidental nuclear war was not a theoretical possibility. It was a statistical inevitability if the systems remained broken. And the world had no idea how close it had come to learning that lesson the hard way. What made the Norwegian rocket incident even more terrifying was not simply that Russia had nearly launched nuclear weapons, but that the world remained completely unaware for years. And when the details finally leaked, most governments and intelligence agencies realized with shock that the near disaster was not just a glitch or a freak coincidence. It was the symptom of a nuclear warning system that had degraded to the point where it could no longer tell the difference between a research launch and the start of World War III. And the reality only got darker as analysts reconstructed the exact timeline, because the more they studied it, the clearer it became that had any single factor been even slightly different, had the rocket's trajectory drifted a few degrees, had a radar station been slower to identify the flight profile, had Yeltsin been out of communication for even 5 minutes, or had a nervous commander misread a line of telemetry, Russia would have fired hundreds of nuclear warheads at the United States before anyone fully understood the misunderstanding. In the aftermath, Russia's strategic rocket forces found themselves in a state of creeping horror as they analyzed how close they had come to irreversible catastrophe. Engineers realized that 3 of Russia's early warning satellites were offline. 2 others were returning inconsistent data, and the satellite responsible for detecting launches in the Norwegian Sea, the exact region the Black Brant-the rocket originated from, had completed its orbit only minutes earlier, leaving a coverage gap that no one had predicted. And because the military budget had collapsed after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no money to replace or repair anything, meaning the entire system had been relying on ground-based radar with limited range and slow refresh rates. While Russia scrambled inside its borders, the CIA and NSA were reconstructing the crisis from intercepted radio chatter, satellite movement, and unusual force posture changes inside Russia. When analysts realized that the Russian Navy had shifted into a silent running posture, and that several missile regiments had been temporarily moved to elevated alert, they began to panic internally, though the White House still had no idea how close the world had come to annihilation, and it would take 3 days before a formal intelligence briefing finally reached the president. When the information did land on the desks of U.S. National Security Council members, the reaction was disbelief, anger, and fear. Disbelief that something so simple could spiral to the brink of global extinction. Anger that Russia's decaying infrastructure had put the entire world at risk. And fear that if the incident had happened in a moment of tension, rather than during a relatively calm geopolitical period, there would not have been enough time, caution, or rationality to prevent nuclear launch authorization. Even worse, analysis by nuclear experts revealed horrifying math. Russia's launch-on-warning doctrine required the president to make a decision in as little as 6 minutes in the event an object was detected coming from the Norwegian Sea, because a submarine-launched Trident missile traveling at several kilometers per second would reach Moscow in roughly 10 to 12 minutes, which meant Yeltsin had less time than someone performing CPR on a cardiac arrest patient, less time than someone trying to escape a house fire, less time than the break between commercial TV segments to determine whether or not to initiate the end of human civilization. Meanwhile, Yeltsin's military staff privately admitted something that Western analysts later confirmed. If the Black Brant rocket had been launched from only 50 to 75 miles further south, still inside Norway, it would have matched the exact initial trajectory of a U.S. nuclear first strike, and the algorithms monitoring Russia's airspace would have automatically pushed the threat level to confirmed inbound attack, forcing the Cheget briefcase to go into active countdown mode, an automated process that would have left Yeltsin with only seconds to override the system or authorize retaliation. And because the Russian military was in shambles, because communication lines were unreliable, because radar operators were overworked and underpaid, and because the entire post-Soviet infrastructure was collapsing, the possibility that Yeltsin might not have even received the Cheget briefcase in time was very real, meaning that the nuclear authorization procedure could have defaulted to the military chain of command, granting authority to generals who were already panicking, already convinced they were witnessing a U.S. EMP precursor strike, and already on the verge of initiating counterstrike procedures. When American analysts reconstructed the physics of the Black Brant routin's flight path, they discovered an even more chilling detail. The rocket's third-stage burn created a plume pattern identical to the pattern generated by the boost phase of a U.S. Trident missile, meaning the radar signature was indistinguishable unless cross-referenced with satellite data, and those satellites were offline. What made the incident all the more disturbing was the political environment inside Russia at the time. Nationalist hardliners in the military believed the West was taking advantage of Russia's weakness, that NATO expansion was a betrayal of earlier promises, and that the United States was preparing for eventual confrontation. Many of these men held deeply conspiratorial views, and some believed the Norwegian rocket was an intentional provocation, a test of Russia's reaction time, or even a disguised EMP weapon meant to blind Russia's remaining radar systems. In fact, internal FSB files later revealed that several senior generals were seconds away from overriding the cautious approach taken by Yeltsin and pushing for immediate readiness to launch missiles from 2 strategic rocket divisions, and only extreme hesitation, caused more by uncertainty than by trust, prevented them from doing so. Norway, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. The scientists who launched the rocket were busy analyzing upper atmospheric conditions, completely unaware that their experiment had triggered the activation of the only nuclear command briefcase ever used in real time, the same Cheget system built at the height of the Cold War to respond to a U.S. first strike. In Oslo, when the news finally reached Norwegian officials days later, they reacted with shock and embarrassment. They had complied with all notification procedures, including sending details to the Russian embassy weeks in advance. But the message had become lost in the chaos of Russia's collapsing governmental bureaucracy. Norwegian diplomats later recalled feeling sick to their stomachs because they realized their country had unwittingly triggered the closest nuclear launch decision since 1962's Cuban Missile Crisis. But the darkest revelation came after a joint intelligence review conducted years later. The Norwegian rocket incident proved beyond doubt that the collapse of the Soviet Union had not eliminated nuclear danger, but had actually multiplied it, because a poor, unstable, politically fractured nuclear superpower with failing detection systems and paranoid military leadership was far more dangerous than the structured, predictable Cold War standoff that had existed for decades. Russia's early warning system was held together by aging wires, unreliable circuits, decaying satellites, and human guesswork. It was a nuclear arsenal without a functioning nervous system, a superpower that could not see but still carried enough warheads to destroy the world multiple times. Yeltsin's decision to hold off on retaliation had prevented catastrophe, But it was also a reminder that nuclear peace had become dependent on individual judgment rather than robust systems. Humanity had survived not because of flawless deterrence, but because one man hesitated. If that man had been different, or absent, or under pressure, the outcome could have been irreversible. And so, as Russia tried to move on, one question lingered in the minds of the few people across the world who understood what had nearly happened. If the world could come this close to nuclear war during a period of relative calm, what would happen during a crisis? What would happen during a future confrontation between Russia and NATO? What would happen if another scientific rocket were launched without perfect communication? The Norwegian rocket incident became a ghost, a silent warning that the greatest nuclear threats were not always missiles, ideologies, or enemy intentions, but the decaying infrastructure of a superpower too broken to trust its own eyes. What the world would only learn many years later, long after the panic had faded inside the Kremlin, long after diplomats stopped whispering about the incident in private, long after intelligence files were quietly downgraded and researchers began piecing together the truth from scattered testimony and half-declassified memos, was that the Norwegian rocket incident did not simply expose a technical failure, nor was it just a geopolitical misunderstanding. It revealed with brutal clarity how catastrophically fragile the post-Soviet nuclear command structure really was, how psychological and political instability inside Russia had made nuclear decision-making far more dangerous than Western analysts had ever imagined, and how a nuclear superpower had come within minutes of annihilating the world because it could not distinguish a scientific research rocket from a first-strike nuclear weapon. In the weeks following the event, Russia's general staff conducted a classified internal audit of the early warning network, and what they found was horrifying. Half of Russia's over-the-horizon radars were offline due to maintenance failures or lack of power. Many crews were operating with outdated manuals. Communications between bases relied on landline cables that had been severed or stolen for copper by desperate civilians. Several satellite uplinks were malfunctioning, and at least 3 crucial radar stations inherited from the Soviet era had been abandoned entirely because no one was being paid to keep them operational. The collapse of the USSR had not just weakened the military, it had gutted the nervous system of the world's largest nuclear arsenal, turning what used to be a hardened, redundant, deeply integrated system into a patchwork of unreliable sensors, blind spots, and undertrained personnel trying to interpret partial data with catastrophic stakes. The audit revealed something even more chilling. On the morning of the Norwegian launch, one of Russia's major early warning radars had been experiencing intermittent blackouts, and technicians had been forced to switch to backup power mid-shift, causing temporary data loss. At the same time, several communication links between the Kola Peninsula radars and Moscow experienced delays, meaning information was arriving in bursts rather than real-time streams. In other words, Russia had seen the Black Brant-the-Poon rocket not as a coherent flight path, but as a series of fragmented, glitchy blips, exactly the kind of pattern that Cold War simulations had warned could indicate an EMP-armed missile designed to confuse defenses. And because the system was never intended to operate in such a degraded state, the alarms escalated automatically, following logic trees built for a Soviet superpower that no longer existed. Commands flowed upward through a chain of half-functional computers and terrified officers who knew that a mistaken decision could end civilization, yet also knew that failure to respond could result in Russia being decapitated by a U.S. first strike. During internal investigations, several officers admitted privately that they believed the United States was likely probing Russia's defenses, testing how Russia would react to ambiguous threats. They were guided not by rational analysis, but by fear. Fear of NATO expansion, fear of Russia's collapse, fear that the West was taking advantage of their weakness. "We thought we were cornered," one former Strategic Rocket Forces officer later recalled. "When a dog is cornered, it strikes." The Norwegian rocket incident also revealed a darker psychological crisis inside Russia's military elite. Many believed that the United States, flush with victory after the Cold War, saw Russia as a defeated nation and would eventually try to neutralize its nuclear arsenal. This paranoia was fueled by constant NATO expansion discussions, economic humiliation, IMF pressures, and a collapsing society where government officials could not even guarantee electricity for radar stations guarding their nuclear weapons. It was a strange, dangerous contradiction. Russia was too weak to maintain its early warning system, but still strong enough to destroy the world if it panicked. And on January 25, 1995, panic had nearly won. At the same time, the political directorate inside the Kremlin was dealing with its own nightmare. Hardliners used the incident to argue that Russia should adopt an even more aggressive automatic retaliation protocol, fully removing human judgment from the decision cycle. They claimed that hesitation was a luxury Russia could not afford, while the United States possessed highly accurate Trident missiles capable of wiping out Russian command within minutes. But cooler heads countered that if Russia automated retaliation any further, the world would not survive the next radar glitch. Their fears were not theoretical. Since the breakup of the USSR, Russia had already experienced over a dozen early warning anomalies caused by satellite failures, radar misreads, and electrical outages. The Norwegian rocket had simply been the first anomaly powerful enough to push the nuclear briefcase into activation. In Washington, the CIA quietly issued an assessment to the White House that contained one of the most chilling sentences ever written in a U.S. intelligence report. Russia is now more likely to launch nuclear weapons by accident than by deliberate policy. This was a seismic shift in nuclear doctrine. During the Cold War, the danger was intentional escalation. Now, the danger was collapse, decay, and misinterpretation. American analysts concluded that Russia's nuclear posture had entered a phase of structural instability, meaning the command system was incapable of reliably filtering real threats from false ones. Meanwhile, in Norway, the scientific team who launched the Black Brant 14 rocket were stunned when the details emerged. Their experiment had been routine. The Black Brant rockets had been launched dozens of times before to study auroras. But this time, it had happened during a perfect storm. A blind spot in Russia's satellite coverage, a misfiled diplomatic notice, and a trajectory that looked indistinguishable from a nuclear attack. Norway immediately overhauled its launch notification system, adding redundant confirmations, direct phone calls, and comprehensive military coordination for all future launches. But the truth was obvious. No amount of paperwork could compensate for a superpower's failing infrastructure. One of the darkest revelations of the entire incident came not from Moscow or Washington, but from Murmansk, where radar operators later admitted that when they first saw the rocket on their screens, several assumed the United States had finally launched an EMP precursor strike designed to disable what remained of Russia's radar network. These operators believed the end had already begun. "We thought we were watching the first seconds of a nuclear attack," one said decades later. "We were waiting for the sky to light up." Inside nuclear command bunkers across Russia, officers quietly prepared themselves for death or retaliation and for the unthinkable, the belief that they would soon be launching missiles that would kill millions. Some wrote notes, some prayed, Some simply went numb. And then the order never came. The rocket curved away. The apocalypse evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. But the psychological scars remained. Even years later, some of the men involved described the incident as a trauma, the moment they realized their entire system was a house of cards. And as the 1990s dragged on, Russia continued to experience alerts, anomalies, and sensor failures, none as serious as the Norwegian incident, but each one a reminder that the danger was not gone. The only reason the world survived January 25, 1995, was because the Russian leadership hesitated, because Yeltsin did not trust the data, because the officers were unsure, because uncertainty prevented action. But uncertainty is not a strategy. It is not a doctrine. It is not a safeguard. It is luck. And luck, as nuclear historians would later write, is the most terrifying foundation on which to build the survival of a species. In the days that followed, as world leaders gradually learned how close humanity had come to destroying itself over a scientific research rocket, the diplomatic machinery of every nuclear-capable nation lurched into motion, scrambling to contain the political fallout and uncover the deeper truth that made the Norwegian rocket incident far more terrifying than anyone first realized. Not only had Russia nearly launched its nuclear arsenal based on a misinterpreted radar signal, but it had done so during a period when its government was fractured, its military was demoralized, its economy was collapsing, its communication systems were barely functional, and its early warning network was operating with fewer than half of its sensors active. The United States quietly sent back-channel messages to reassure Moscow that no threat had ever been present, while NATO intelligence committees met to revise their understanding of the Russian command system, an understanding that now had to account for the presence of desperation, fear, and political chaos rather than stable Cold War logic. The U.S. Strategic Command produced an internal report concluding that Russian nuclear readiness remains characterized by high alert posture, combined with degraded command and control reliability, an extraordinarily dangerous combination, because the more decayed and fragile the system became, the more pressure hardliners applied to respond rapidly to any perceived threat, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where weakness produced fear, and fear produced aggression. Russian political elites were equally shaken. President Boris Yeltsin, already dealing with health problems, political opposition, and an increasingly confrontational parliament, realized that his authority over the nuclear chain of command was not nearly as secure as he had believed. The mere fact that Russia had progressed all the way to activating the nuclear briefcase meant the system had advanced to its brink without meaningful human skepticism at lower levels. Several generals later admitted that they would not have questioned a launch order had Yeltsin issued it, even if doubts remained about the radar data's accuracy. This blind obedience to protocol, inherited from Soviet military culture, could have led the world into nuclear winter based on a single misread blip. Yeltsin privately told foreign diplomats that the incident had frightened him more than any moment during the Cold War, because during the Cold War he felt he understood the enemy and the system around him. Now he felt surrounded by collapsing institutions, unpredictable radar reports, and military hardliners whose loyalty was uncertain. Western intelligence agencies sensed this instability immediately. The CIA issued a confidential memo warning that Russian nuclear decision-making is increasingly vulnerable to misinterpretation, decaying infrastructure, and political fragmentation. And U.S. policymakers realized that humanitarian aid and economic support were no longer simply moral gestures. They were now part of global nuclear risk reduction. If Russia collapsed further, If its early warning capability deteriorated any more, then accidental nuclear war could become not a remote possibility, but a recurring threat. In Oslo, the Norwegian government launched its own review. They had sent the proper notifications of their rocket launch months earlier, but the message had been lost deep inside Russia's fractured bureaucracy, misplaced, ignored, or never passed upward. Norway implemented new safeguards, including direct confirmation channels that bypassed Russia's foreign ministry and communicated directly with military early warning stations. Scientists were shocked that a purely academic experiment had nearly brought the world to nuclear catastrophe. But the truth was that the rocket itself had played a minor role. The real threat had been the geopolitical environment, the decayed infrastructure, and the fragile psychology of a nuclear power in freefall. Meanwhile, global observers began revisiting a chilling question. If this could happen in 1995, after the Cold War, in relative peace, how many times had the world nearly ended during moments of high tension? How many nuclear close calls had been erased from records, concealed by governments, or misunderstood by the public? The Norwegian rocket incident suddenly joined a list of terrifying events. The 1983 Soviet false alarm, prevented by Stanislav Petrov, the 1979 U.S. NORAD training tape that simulated a full Soviet strike, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis submarine incident involving Vasily Arkhipov, the 1973 Yom Kippur Panic. Each near miss was a reminder that nuclear stability rested not on perfect systems, but on imperfect humans, choosing restraint at moments when fear and protocol demanded escalation. Nuclear. Strategists began referring to these events as the thin line, the razor-thin margin between survival and annihilation, held in place only by individual judgment and luck rather than robust, error-proof systems. Within Russia, military analysts quietly acknowledged that the incident exposed a harsh truth. If a real first strike had occurred that morning, Russia's defenses would likely have been too slow and too broken to respond effectively. Their radar network was riddled with blind spots, their satellite constellation was half inoperable, and their command structure was plagued by political paralysis. This insecurity encouraged some generals to push for even more aggressive early launch protocols, including proposals for automatic retaliation upon detection of certain radar signatures, proposals that horrified Western officials because automation removes human hesitation, and hesitation is often the only thing preventing nuclear war. When the story eventually became public, journalists initially treated it as a bizarre anomaly, a historical curiosity, a weather rocket mistaken for a missile. But behind the headlines, experts understood the deeper message. The Cold War had ended politically, but not structurally. The weapons remained, the hair trigger alert status remained, the decaying infrastructure remained, the bureaucratic inertia remained, and human fallibility remained. The Norwegian rocket incident proved that nuclear Armageddon no longer required malice, ideology, or geopolitical ambition, only a radar glitch and a frightened military operating in the dark. It also served as a sobering revelation about the illusions of nuclear stability. For decades, nuclear theorists had argued that mutually assured destruction created predictability. Both sides would act rationally to avoid suicide. But the incident demonstrated that the true danger lies not in rational decisions, but in irrational environments. Miscommunications, decaying radars, political instability, undertrained officers, and leaders making existential choices with incomplete information. The logic of deterrence assumes perfect clarity. The reality is fog, noise, fear, and broken machinery. When historians look back on the nerve-shredding events of January 25, 1995, Many conclude that the world survived not because protocols worked, but because they failed slowly enough for humans to intervene. The nuclear briefcase opened, the generals moved through their checklists, and the system advanced step by step toward irreversible catastrophe. But delays, doubts, and human uncertainty magnified the gaps between steps just long enough for the truth to emerge. Nuclear weapons are designed to remove hesitation. Human survival depends on hesitation. That contradiction is the core instability of the nuclear age. What makes the Norwegian rocket incident so haunting is its simplicity. One rocket, one radar misinterpretation, one paperwork failure, one nervous military, one unpredictable president, one decaying superpower, and the entire world hung in the balance. No ideological conflict, no battlefield exchange, no geopolitical crisis, just a scientific experiment mistaken for the end of civilization. The incident is now taught in military academies as a case study in nuclear command failure, a reminder that vigilance requires not only powerful weapons, but functional infrastructure, accurate communication, and stable leadership. It is also a reminder that peaceful times are not safe times. Accidental war is most likely when nations believe they are not at war at all. In the end, the Norwegian rocket incident was not a story of missiles or radars. It was a story of fragility. Fragile systems, fragile institutions, fragile assumptions. And the most fragile of all, the belief that the world will always be saved by wise decisions rather than blind luck. On January 25, 1995, humanity survived purely because a handful of men, faced with incomplete data and enormous pressure, chose caution over instinct. But history makes one thing clear: luck is not eternal. And as long as nuclear weapons exist, guarded by imperfect humans, maintained by imperfect governments, detected by imperfect machines, another Norwegian rocket incident is not a question of if, but when.